Hi, everybody. We'll get started in just a minute. We're giving people a chance to enter the webinar. Okay, let's get going. Hi, everybody. Welcome. You have come to Assault on Dr. King's Vision, the Rise of the Far Right and the Attack on Democracy. This workshop is going to explore recent trends and threats posed by anti-democratic movements, unpack the rhetoric, and discuss new ways to defend democracy. My name is Katie Harris. I'm from the workshop committee of the Seattle MLK Organizing Coalition. I'm a white woman with short curly gray hair and black framed glasses, and I am sitting in my home office in West Seattle. Before we get going, I want to mention a couple of housekeeping details. One is that you can access closed captioning by looking at the bottom of your screen, your Zoom screen, and you'll see a button that says Live Transcript CC. That is where you activate captioning. In terms of the chat, the presenters will see, or the presenter will see what you put in the chat. You will not see anything posted by other attendees in the chat. The Q&A will be active throughout the entire workshop. You are welcome to post your questions at any time for our speaker. Our speaker tonight is Devin Burkhardt, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Research and Education on Human Rights. Since 1983, IREHR has served as a social justice organization dedicated to standing against bigotry and defending democracy and human rights. Using investigative research and strategic organizing to counter racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, nativism, homophobia, and other forms of bigotry, the center unmasks movements, organizations, and individuals that threaten democracy and human rights. So now I'd like to turn it over to Devin Burkhardt.
Hey, everyone. It's so nice to be here with you all today. I want to thank the coalition for giving me the opportunity to speak with you all and for you all taking some time out of your busy weeks to be here with us today. As Katie said, my name is Devin Burkhardt. I'm the director of the Institute for Research and Education on Human Rights. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Institute, we've played a kind of behind the scenes role in promoting organizations that challenge the far right and deal with attacks on democracy and human rights, and we have for many, many years. Our founder was Leonard Zeskin, who has literally written the book on white nationalism. If you haven't had a chance to read it, I encourage you to get your hands on a copy of Blood and Politics, a history of the white nationalist movement from the margins to the mainstream. It will help better than I could do during the course of this conversation unpack the last 40 years and help make sense of this continual march of the far right from the margins to the mainstream. This particular day, this particular moment is really particularly important to me. One of IREHR's longtime mentors and one of our leading voices who passed last year was the Reverend C.T. Vivian, who was Dr. King's right hand and leader of SCLC for many, many years. C.T. was an incredible supporter of the work that we did at the Institute and was always concerned about the far right, be it in showing up in Klan robes or paramilitary garb. He understood the threat that posed to civil and human rights, and he encouraged us to stay in the fight, to continue to challenge those efforts and to move forward, to live out Dr. King's vision. That's part of why we come here today, to live out that vision that Dr. King had so many years ago. And while the arc of the moral universe may bend towards justice, white nationalists and others on the far right seek to undermine that arc with a vision that others have described as barbarism with a human face. Make no doubt about it. Today, our democracy is in danger. And I don't want to sound alarmist, but we're at risk of losing all of the gains that so many civil rights heroes, named and unnamed, remembered and forgotten, struggled and died for. The ultimate irony today is that so many who oppose virtually everything that Dr. King stood for have appropriated his name, his image, and his slogans, all in the name of pushing an even bigger lie, that lie of white victimhood and racial resentment. So instead of a beautiful vision of a beloved community, we're left with a hellscape of hyper-individualism, of pandemic be damned, I need to get what I have. How did we get to this place? And what are we going to do about it? That is the question of the day. And this is the question that is going to define not only this generation, but generations to come. So allow me to share my screen with you here. We have images, many, many images of January 6th. We remember that assault on democracy. We remember the impact that it had on so many of us. But how did we get to this place, and what are we going to do about it? What I want to do is talk with you today about three different things. First and foremost, how we got here. How did we get to this point where we had an armed insurrection on our democracy and an attempt to overthrow a just and fair election? Secondly, I want to look at where we're at. This is what I call the ABCs of post-insurrection dynamics. And then lastly, I want to leave you with some hope. I want to give you 10 things that you can do to help defend democracy and live out Dr. King's vision so we can move forward as we memorialize this, not only this day, but we continue to strive for that vision. Now, it's important for us to remember that all of this comes in the context of the pandemic and the rise of the continuing struggle and the movement for Black lives, as well as the continuing threat of far-right violence, from El Paso to San Diego, from Pittsburgh to Charlottesville, from Kansas City to Oak Creek. Watered with the blood of victims, the roots of bigotry run deep in American history. And over the last 4 years, they bore bitter fruit in the hot sun of the Trump era. As we look at the pictures, and these pictures are often disturbing, we need to remember that Heraclitus once said, you can't step twice in the same stream. Our world is constantly changing under our feet, and we need to be aware of those changes, lest we keep fighting the last fight rather than the one that's seeking to engage and change our world. It's also important to remember that as these scenes were taking place in our nation's capital, they were also taking place right here in our state capital as well, as insurrectionists were trying to storm the halls of Congress in Washington, D.C. They were also trying to break into the governor's mansion here in our state, here in Olympia. So the battle is taking place not only here, but also nationally. And we need to be aware of both of those factors as we continue to move and challenge the forces of insurrection. That drumbeat, the ceaseless far-right march from the margins to the mainstream, has not stopped. And the question is, what are we going to do about it and how we deal with this problem? Because racism is ever changing, adapting to circumstances and surrounding. In Dr. King's era, it was not just the Klan. It was the White Citizens Councils. It was the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission. It was the institutions of power that maintained Jim and Jane Crow segregation. As the civil rights movement advances, the terrain in the fight made against racism shifted, particularly in the years after Dr. King was assassinated. to challenges like education and busing. Those shifts, again, are happening in the midst of the pandemic and after the January 6th insurrection. So let's start by looking at that coalition that made up the insurrectionists. Amongst the over 700 people arrested so far for the insurrection, we know that there were a large number of them who fit into some of these different movement categories. We start with, of course, with Tea Partiers. They are, in some ways, the OGs of the current MAGA movement. They were the movement between 2009 and 2016. They helped kind of break down the issue silos amongst the far right and really repopularize the ideas of racial resentment and white dispossession to a much larger movement. At their height, they had a core of over 500,000 members, a supporter base, that second layer, of 7 to 8 million people, and sympathy of between 18 and 40% of the American public, depending on how you gauged it. Tea Party groups actively helped not only support the events early in the day during January 6th, but Tea Partiers participated in the rallies and also participated in the so-called Stop the Steal efforts to try to popularize the big lie that the election was somehow stolen. They played a really important role in helping radicalize a large base of the American public around the issues of white resentment. If you look at a study, for instance, by Plus One, it found a latitudinal study found that over time, the more people were involved in this far right movement, the more racist they became. They sowed the seeds for what was to come on January 6th, and they have a role to play in that. There are, in fact, a number of Tea Party groups still active here in Washington State, including the Kitsap Patriots, who continue to push many of the same ideas that they did before. They are not alone, however. There are QAnon conspiracists who have adopted the old anti-Semitic conspiracy tropes and applied them into the digital world, believing that there's somehow a secret cabal of pedophiles drinking the blood of babies to maintain their youth. Old tropes in a new bottle. There are also many of those arrested who were COVID insurrectionists or COVID deniers. We'll talk more about these because this is where the action is today. COVID denial is really moving the far right into 2022 and beyond as they continue to use the pandemic as an organizing vehicle to reintroduce the ideas around racial resentment, around things like critical race theory and other outlandish conspiracies. Today, of course, we saw the arrest of Stuart Rhodes and the indictment of Stuart Rhodes and a number of the other Oath Keepers and far-right paramilitaries involved in the storming of the Capitol. We continue to have a problem with far-right paramilitaries here in the state of Washington. We track at the Institute 29 different far-right paramilitary groups in the state. Those include groups like the Oath Keepers, the 3%ers, the militias, and other far-right paramilitaries. Like many of the others, these groups have pivoted away from engaging in armed paramilitary training and are looking to get elected in local office. An Eatonville school board member was the leader of one of the 3%er groups and was just recently featured in the Washington Post. It also includes groups like racist reactionaries and white nationalists. These are groups like the Proud Boys and the so-called Groypers. On this cutting edge of the movement, these are the activists, the street soldiers, pushing the movement forward and helping to keep a new generation alive with the ideas of racial resentment and white supremacy, constantly evolving and revolving these ideas and reshaping it for a new generation. Again, as you can see, many of the photos from that event were quite shocking. As we sat that day and watched here in the IREHR offices over many different screens, you saw the continued attempt to overturn the election using violent means, and a new coalition that had taken up arms and was prepared to overthrow a democratically elected opposition. So this coalition continues to change and continues to morph. As IREHR's founder, Leonard Zeskin, often talks about, it's a lot like a tube of toothpaste. When you squeeze it at one end, when there is a shift or a dynamic in the real world, it pushes the areas to other areas. and the goop flows to other positions. So we're seeing that change right now in this new coalition. And that's really what I want to talk about, where we are now and the kind of ABCs of this new coalition. Because remember, just as the names of the organizations may change, the ideas behind them are often quite similar, and they share some important themes that we need to identify to understand what we're looking at going forward. One of those important themes, of course, the first one we'll talk about, is that the anti-democratic nature, small d, the anti-democratic nature of the far right today. As you can see from this photo, many of those who participated in January 6th and continue to be active on the far right pushed the big lie that the election was stolen. They did that in part because of the results, but also because of the antipathy towards democracy. They not only believe that the United States is a quote unquote republic, not a democracy, which, as we have moved forward post-Civil War has certainly changed. They have also argued for, among other things, eliminating things like the 17th Amendment, the direct election of senators. The antipathy towards democracy is strong across the far right. Is something they share and has certainly played out in the policy arena over the last year, post January 6th, where they've attempted to pass voter suppression laws in 41 different states, being successful in over 20 of them, to try to roll back the gains made by the civil rights movement, to try to push for the extension of the franchise, to make it harder, particularly for people of color and poor folks, to participate in the process and to participate in democracy at all. It is a challenge that is going to be among the most important as we head into 2022, as they continue to make those changes and push back in that sort of opposition. The second area that they share in common, the B of the ABCs, is Black Lives Matter opposition. We certainly saw this over the past year, leading into the 2020 election, where far-right paramilitary organizations, racist reactionary groups like the Proud Boys, and COVID denial groups turned out on the streets to protest in opposition to counter-protest demonstrations in support of Black lives. This is in part grounded in their belief in a kind of white dispossession, that somehow, because we have changing demographics in this country, that white people are being dispossessed of their power and privilege, and the kind of racial resentment of the kind of increasing visibility of people of color in this country. This is something that has bound them together for many years and has shifted to the fore, particularly in many of these challenges. So this is something important to keep in mind, that this is always there. While they may push one idea or one policy proposal out in front, the opposition to Black Lives Matter and the racial resentment and white dispossession are always at the core of the movements that we're talking about today and drive them forward. It's also important to talk about the C in the ABCs of the current far-right coalition. One of those C's could stand for conspiracies. The notions of conspiracy theories are essential to binding together the far right. The belief that there is somehow a secret cabal controlling the levers of trade and finance is part of the key, whether it be in QAnon or any of the other far rightists. There is a belief in conspiratorial thinking that guides their positions and their policy proposals and leads them to do things, to carry out acts of vicious desperation. It also bleeds into their kind of nationalism, which posits that so-called middle Americans, or the productive classes in the middle, are being squeezed from above in this conspiracy by the elites, by the multiculturalists, by the multinational corporations, and from below by the multicultural hordes, by people of color and others working in collusion with those on the top to squeeze so-called middle Americans. It's this framework that guides so much of the far right today and is really important to understanding what they're talking about and where they're going. That C could also, and really does over the past 2 years, stand for COVID denial. COVID denial is the guiding factor which has driven so much far-right activism, particularly after January 6th. After January 6th, it was much harder to show up as a far-right paramilitarist because of the stain of January 6th, or to be an oath keeper, or to be a Proud Boy. So many of those individuals involved in those groups flooded into COVID denial activism and used that as a platform to promote the same ideas of racial resentment and white superiority. Let us not forget that a year ago, in March of 2020, it was, far-right paramilitarists who barged in and staged an insurrection in capitals around the country, in places like Michigan and Wisconsin and other parts around the country. They provided a framework for engaging in the kind of insurrection that we saw leading up to January 6th, and they continue to play a role in those movements. The idea that they're not going to comply with the laws and the prescriptions to try to prevent the spread of the pandemic has become a constant refrain and a theme. The idea that that freedom is the cure, and the idea that faith over fear are chants that are guiding many of these folks as they push things like denial that the COVID is a problem, to the conspiracies about the vaccines, to pushing back against efforts to try to rein in the spread of COVID. In fact, as I mentioned, they provided the trial run for the Capitol insurrection in states around the country, including here in Washington and in Oregon, where they helped invade the capitals and provided a model, if you will, for how to carry about that kind of activity. COVID denial is the number one problem we're chasing on the far right. How bad is it now? These are the numbers that we recently documented in a report that IREHR released last fall called Facebook and COVID Denial. We found that on Facebook alone, there were 1,732 COVID denial Facebook groups. In those groups, there were 2,400,000 members of those different groups. And believe it or not, this isn't a problem that exists, in the Deep South or somewhere else. This is a problem right here. In fact, Washington State ranked 3rd nationally overall in terms of the number of members of COVID denial groups, with over 150,000 people subscribed to Washington State-based COVID denial groups. That's remarkable and has an impact on the public policy landscape and the threats to healthcare workers, to nurses and doctors, to school administrators, to teachers, and is changing the nature of the way this stuff is playing out on the ground around the state. So what is COVID denial? It is the efforts to push back against any effort to try to rein in the pandemic. It appears in several different manifestations, be it anti-vax, anti-mask, anti-mandate, that, the need to prematurely reopen or end the lockdowns when they existed, or a whole variety of the two. On the screen right there, you'll see the kind of breakdown we have in those numbers and what they look like. Many of the groups, even when they started just talking about reopening, now have the most vicious COVID conspiracies running through them, including talking about hanging Dr. Fauci, taking out healthcare providers, et cetera, et cetera. The situation is quite dire, and it has come in 2 different ways. Just as COVID has come in multiple waves, we've seen this spread in multiple different waves, and we are continuing to see an increase in those numbers today. This has not abated. As much as we'd like to think that it's gone away, it has not. It's also a problem that is nationwide. As I mentioned, Washington State is a problem, but as you'll see by visiting our website, the problem is nationwide. It infests every part of the country, and it is animating the far right quite specifically. And another area where it's really important, and I can't stress this enough, is how it has allowed for the increased participation of women in the far right. You see, before, in the 30 years that I've been doing this work, the most successful that far right activists had in women's participation was the Tea Party, which had roughly 66% male participation, 33% women. Today, that number is nearly 50-50. as the level of women's participation in this movement has grown dramatically as a result of the focus on COVID denial. That's in part because of the focus around health and schools, but it's also in part because women are playing more leadership roles. In fact, in the leading COVID denial group in the country, a group run by Ammon Bunty called People's Rights, nearly 50% of the local leaders are women. Overall, a surprisingly large number of women are now participating in this movement thanks to the focus on COVID-19 and the attempts to change that. So once again, those stereotypes we had about what the far right looks like are being broken down as things change and morph under our feet. You know, as we said, can't step twice in that same stream. Much of this activity initiates on Facebook and other social media platforms, but it has spread elsewhere quite dramatically. This stuff is taking place in the real world. Just yesterday in Washougal, for instance, there was a big rally where they attempted to barge into a local meeting. This is taking place at local school board meetings, at health administration meetings, and around the country. They're engaging in kind of harassment and intimidation. And it's also radicalizing folks. It's moving them from just, you know, they may have started for a concern about the pandemic, but are rapidly becoming more radicalized and moving into areas of racial resentment. Thanks to the introduction of things like the opposition to so-called critical race theory and sex education at the, you know, at the school board level. These ideas and the conspiratorial thinking are rapidly moving people along a radicalized path. What used to take years to radicalize folks, thanks in no small part now to social media, is now taking weeks and months. It has dramatically increased the speed in which people are radicalized because they're in this self-enclosed echo chamber with nothing to burst that bubble, nothing to push back against the kind of claims that they're experiencing, fed to them a 24-hour loop. It has driven this stuff on the ground dramatically, where we're seeing literally thousands of events. We were unable to keep track of the massive number that took place around the country over the last year. That radicalization is often occurring around conspiracies and anti-Semitism. One of the things that they've done, just like they've tried to appropriate Dr. King's image, is they've latched on to the symbols of those who suffered and died during the Holocaust, even though every Jewish institution in the country has spoken out specifically about how wrong this is to try to appropriate those images and that pain for their so-called victimhood, for being forced to wear a mask and equivocating the two, or having to take a shot. That's where we're at today. At the same time that they're glomming onto that, they've also promoted countless, endless conspiracy theories about how the COVID-19 vaccine is a Jewish plot to try to indoctrinate us, and it's all part of a Soros or Gates or other conspiracy to try to drive whatever part of their complicated and complex vision that they see. They've gone so far now as to adopt the slogan "Pure Blood." They believe, believe that because they're unmasked and unvaccinated and unafraid, that somehow this is a purity of blood, which obviously has some serious racial implications going back to the Nazis. And as a result, this activism, one of their biggest targets right now is schools. There has been a fusion of COVID denial groups with the so-called critical race theory attacks. In other words, the kind of presentation I'm doing today, talking about history or talking about the current state of things, would be outlawed under many of the pieces of legislation that these folks are pushing in other states around critical race theory. They've also fused it with anti-LGBTQIA+ efforts to oppose comprehensive sex education and other anti-trans efforts that they're pushing. And it's also led to a significant increase in attacks on school board members, administrators, teachers, staff, and students. As the partner to a teacher, I can tell you that this is a real problem right here in Seattle, and it's a never-ending challenge. It's such a challenge that the School Board Association asked for federal intervention to quell these attacks. It's also fused them with far-right groups. No other more important than Ammon Bundy and his organization, the People's Rights Network, which has now grown to chapters in 22 different states and has over 35,000 members, which has fused together far-right paramilitarists, groups like the Proud Boys, and COVID deniers and anti-vaxxers into one solid mass of militants pushing back against the COVID vaccine. It has changed the dynamic in local communities. As you can see in this state, they've broken it into 8 different regions, and they continue to work to expand their reach and their network. And while we celebrate the arrest today of the indictment today of Stuart Rhodes, far-right paramilitary groups continue to be a problem and a challenge here. The COVID deniers are not the only ones facing this problem. But lastly, they've even tried to break up the state of Washington and are now pushing for a greater Idaho, which would divide Oregon in half and move part of it to Idaho. It's a real regional challenge that we face and something that will not go away. Before I move on to what we can do, I also want to talk about Generation Next, what many white nationalists are doing to recruit a new generation of activists. As you can see here, the gentleman with the megaphone there is a guy by the name of Nick Fuentes. He's an active Zoomer who's used social media and his own platform to draw a massive base of support around the country to not only attract white nationalists to his cause, but also to gain support amongst the mainstream. At his last conference, for instance, he had Arizona U.S. Representative Paul Gosar speak, and recently Arizona State Representative Wendy Rogers tweeted out supportive tweets for him. He's a person who's an open white nationalist, an anti-Semite, a Holocaust denier, and yet he is retooling and using new techniques to try to reach this new generation. Like others, he's participated in COVID denial events and was one of the core members of those who were leading the Stop the Steal efforts. So it is a problem that, while we think would die out with the last generation, it is one that people are trying to rekindle and reform for another generation. So this fight is not over. It was not over in Dr. King's era. It is not over in this era. It will not be over until we can fully live out those ideals of a beloved community. If you're more interested in reading about what this new generation looked like, on our website, we've got a report called From Alt-Right to Groyper. It talks about how they rebranded and how they continue to do this. I'd encourage you to take a look at that. It'll provide you some more insights into some of the stuff that we're talking about today. I know that's a lot. I went through that pretty quickly. There's a lot of things going on there in terms of what we're facing in terms of the challenge and the ABCs of that new coalition. But there is hope. There are lots of new efforts, lots of new ways in which we can work together to defend democracy and human rights and advance our efforts, not just play defense. One of the things I do when I'm not doing this work is I love to play hockey. And one of the things we learn in hockey quite early on is one of the worst things you can do is be standing in the neutral zone. We've got to learn to both be able to creatively and efficiently play offense while at the same time defending democracy and human rights. So I'm just going to run you through a quick top 10 list, and then I want to hear from you all about what we can do together to really help defend democracy and human rights. So let's get into it. The first thing we've got to do is inoculate our communities, right? One of the challenges that happens is that there are efforts to try to infiltrate various different communities and try to introduce this stuff in new forms. This happens today in every different format you can imagine. We need to help develop both the ability to isolate and inoculate ourselves from this problem, but also then continue to move the ball forward. One of the ways you can figure out where the problem areas are is by researching and documenting it. Documenting the facts about a white nationalist or bigoted group and its actions can be the first step in a lot of ways to ending the denial and the silence that allows these groups to grow. Solid information can allow you to expose and counter the bigotry promoted by the group, determine who and how they're targeting for recruitment, and alert the community to the threat the group poses. To find information about the group or event, go to their website, search their social media profiles, and contact organizations that specialize in research about these groups like ours. If you find a group, you see a flyer, you get a brochure, you see graffiti and you don't know what it is, feel free to contact us. We can help you identify it. We can provide you additional resources to help you understand that. Also, help send us reports. We just got a report today, for instance, from Ferndale, where a new anti-vaxxer publication was being mailed out to hundreds of thousands of people in the area. That allowed us to try to get a sense of who the group was and to help unpack that for local activists up there. That's important. It really does make a difference. Thirdly, reach out to the community and build coalitions. Right? One of the things we need to do is learn to face the fear together. Right? Part of what happens is the far right groups thrive when they force us into isolation and into fear. Once you've done some research, reach out to the community groups in your area and let them know that the problem is happening. Right? This stuff feeds in silence, and it's designed specifically to drive people back into the shadows. Share information about what you found and call people together to discuss the response. While bigoted groups often target one group at a time, little digging usually finds that their goals threaten many, many different groups in the community, right? Just because an anti-vaxxer is currently targeting healthcare officials, it doesn't mean that they're not going to show up and target school board officials or teachers. Doesn't mean that they're not going to show up in your workplace. Doesn't mean that they're not going to show up and it's not going to impact your home. Reach out broadly in groups that in the community targeted by the far right or who hold values and interests who are threatened. Fourth, develop a message that both counters and offers alternatives. This is a message that CT Vivian often stressed to us. Not only do we need to be able to push away the bad things that the far right is proposing, the kind of conspiracies and the racism and bigotry, but we also have to offer alternatives to the problems that they're that they're trying to tap into. So in the course of the pandemic, we need to offer different visions for how we handle the pandemic, whether that be through mutual aid or through different ways, government can act in terms of countering the pandemic, or what we can do in our workplaces or in our community to offer those alternatives so that the only voices being heard are not those of the far right. Fifthly, and this is essential, we need to speak out and hold counter events when events happen. Right? So when the far right comes to town, we need to speak out and give them make it clear that this is not happening without any kind of response. Over the years, having infiltrated numerous far right groups, I can tell you that one of the things they do is they hold events to see where a community is going to give them a green light. If there is a no response, they know that they have the green light to go ahead and move forward, and to that they have a receptive voice in that community. A visible community presence for racial justice and can lessen the isolation felt by the targets of far-right bigotry and violence. Now, please, please, please avoid cookie cutter solutions and do what fits best for your community and addresses the problems that you're dealing with. Examples of possible actions can include rallies at the site of the event, community gatherings far away from the event, hold press conferences to announce your event, set up public hearings to get the word out, participate in community hearings, make your voices heard. Don't let the only voices be heard on these issues be the far right. That's also important around engaging the press, right? These folks have gotten significantly more press and media savvy, particularly on social media. We need to learn better how to engage the press and to get our message out there so that the only voice not being heard is the far right. So they get a frame a puff piece that allows them to get their message out without any kind of challenge. It's also important then to expose this kind of stuff. And by doing so, engaging the press is a really key element of that. Seventh, encourage community leaders to speak out, right? So in your community, identify those leaders who are essential, who have spoken out about racial and social justice issues in the past, and encourage them to speak out in opposition to what you're seeing in that community. It's important to have multiple voices from multiple different segments of our community speaking out in opposition. That's why we've always tried to build coalitions as broadly as possible, bringing together folks from different faith denominations and folks of no faith, from different different backgrounds, different business and labor, from a variety of different communities, from people of color and white folks and other folks coming together to encourage leaders in the community to speak out. And in doing so, not only speak out, but work in the constituencies targeted for recruitment, right? One of the things that happens with the far right is they look for areas of vulnerability. So right now, for instance, in the midst of the pandemic, they're both targeting healthcare workers for harassment, but also trying to recruit those who might be concerned about the vaccine, or have some concerns about the current state of what's going on. So they've tried to draw them in and recruit them. In other cases, like in the case of white power music, they've tried to reach into the different music scenes to look for people who are vulnerable in those scenes to try to draw them in, figure out where they're targeting their recruitment efforts, and try to do something to work in those constituencies to do the things we've talked about right now, to inoculate them, to get folks to speak out, and to really work in those areas. Lastly, we've got to work for those long-term solutions to build that vision of a beloved community. This isn't a short-term thing. This is a marathon, not a sprint. And the work that we do today can be built upon in further years and further generations to continue to advance the cause of racial and social justice. And that means targeting communities for those long-term solutions and change. This is not about maintaining the status quo. It's about moving forward and living out that vision of a beloved community. And lastly, amongst groups like Generation Next, encourage peer-based responses, right? Have young people engage in these issues, help them along the way, give them aid and support, but let them do their own thing. They know their communities. They know how to deal with these issues. They know their peers better than we can do. I can tell you, when I started doing this work, my first protest was when I was 13 or 14, when a guy by the name of Robert Matthews came to Spokane. Robert Matthews would go on to lead the Order, a neo-Nazi terror organization. And the last thing I wanted to do then was listen to somebody my age now tell me about how to do things in my community, about white power skinheads who were trying to beat up or recruit my friends. But I learned from others along the way and was mentored by those who helped me understand different ways and new approaches to dealing with these issues. And for that, I am eternally thankful, and I will continue to try to help in any way I can do that. That's always been part of our mission here at IREHR, to encourage those peer-based responses and provide the resources that allows that next generation to come up and do great and amazing things and move this issue forward. Lastly, all of the things I just mentioned in terms of responses are available on our app. It's called Trepper, the anti-bigotry app. It's available for both Android and iOS phones. Not only can you use it to document far-right activity, but it also provides you a toolkit for what to do when the far right comes to town, and keep you up to date on some of the more recent research that we're doing. If you have any questions beyond today, or if you have an issue that you need to raise, here's my contact information. I would encourage you to contact me. Please let me know what I can do. We're here to help. We have offices both here in the Seattle area and in Kansas City. And like I said, we're going to continue to move this forward, because that's what CT would have wanted. A few months after CT died, his daughter sent to the IREHR offices a box that contained a note from CT saying, how much he loved the work that we were doing and how much he wanted us to continue it. He also sent us one of his ties. It's something we'll have in the office, is something to remember him by. But it's not just a memento, it's an important reminder of the need to get out there and challenge racism and bigotry in its many forms each and every day in each and every way that we can, and come together to fight the fear and stand united to defend democracy and human rights. With that, I hope you have questions. I hope you have things you want to share. I'm looking forward to the conversation. Thank you all.
Thank you. We have a number of questions that the audience has asked. And I want to start with one. Given the difference in the degree of discipline on the right from the left, which is like herding cats, how do you recommend approaching this difference in terms of organizing?
Well, I think the first thing we need to do is we need to get more deliberate about our organizing and be more organized, right? It shouldn't be herding cats. I know that there's a streak amongst us who, and that's important to have that individualism. But I also think that one of the lessons I learned from CT and from many of the other civil rights heroes I spoke with over the years is the importance of having that kind of discipline and having, concerted, deep work to try to build a movement that is deadly serious about making social change, right? That this isn't just subcultural work, but it is work designed to make long-term lasting impacts in people's lives. That's part of it, I think, that we need to do for the long term. I think we also need to be more serious about organizing generally. I think we need, both new ways and new techniques for organizing folks. And we need a focus on it around these issues that bring people together and work towards, a common agenda. I know that we could spend all day talking about this particular question. I hope that's a brief answer. If not, if we have other questions, I can come back to this one later.
Okay. What are your thoughts about how the Seattle Police Department has handled the officers who attended the January 6th insurrection?
I think it's a travesty. I think it's a travesty that, anyone in law enforcement who was at that event, who participated in any way, whether or not they actually went into the Capitol, still has a badge, full stop. I think it's also, equally criminal that folks that folks who put Nazi insignias on their door, as they have in some suburban areas, that they still have a job. Those in law enforcement are meant to protect us all. And the fact that they've engaged in this level of activity means that they are disqualified from being able to do that effectively. It is no different in many ways than the kind of problematic perspective that law enforcement had during Dr. King's era. And it is shameful that the Seattle Police Department continues to allow that to go on.
Related to that, is there any kind of legislation at the state level that can happen to reduce the power of police guilds?
It's a little bit outside my area of expertise, but I think that there is certainly, I know a number of states are looking at that because they've had that problem. As an organization that has generally always supported the rights of people to organize into unions. It is a bit of a tricky area, but those who are in positions of power, who literally have the power of life and death over others, simply shouldn't be allowed to have the ability to participate in attempting to overthrow a democratic election. Full stop, right? I mean, whether or not it's because they, hold racist views or they engage in racist conduct, or they participate in groups who advocate for a civil war or trying to overturn an election, those things should be immediately disqualifying for folks in the police.
There's a comment and a question related to the photo of the governor's house surrounded by insurrectionists who did not have any police to stop them. And this person says, I participated in a Black Lives Matter march to the governor's home in the summer of 2020, and we could not get that close at all.
Yes, the level of hypocrisy in the way that law enforcement treated Black Lives Matter and the way that they treated those folks who participated in the efforts that broke down the gate and attempted to storm the governor's mansion are dramatically different. We've documented those along with our friends at the Political Research Associates. We looked at the number of police officers who engaged with counter demonstrators supportively during the Black Lives Matter demonstration, and in places like Snohomish County and in Pierce County, and in other parts of the state, there were law enforcement officials who were actually working with or alongside far-right paramilitarists and other far-right counter demonstrators against those who were out demonstrating for Black lives. And that is deeply concerning and is something we need to push back on, because again, like everything, law enforcement is a political question, and how we have law enforcement act and how these folks engage is in part determined by the folks that we elect and the folks that we allow to have those positions. We need to take better action about that. I mean, it's not just that they are participating in some instances. In some cases, far-right groups, like one called the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association, is actually holding events to train law enforcement officers, including some from this state who have participated in those kinds of trainings. The CPOAS, that group is run by Sheriff Richard Mack, a militia enthusiast who, before running a bunch of trainings over the summer for police officers around the country, was running across the country doing COVID denial workshops with an anti-Semitic conspiracy theorist. But he is now able to have law enforcement officers go to his trainings and get credit for attending those trainings in the states of Texas and Virginia. So it's a problem that continues to evolve as far-rightists continue to try to win over sheriffs and other law enforcement officers to their side.
Mm-hmm. Could you speak to the importance of the problem posed by low turnout local races?
Well, I think that the far right has figured out, quite smartly, I might add, that low turnout local races are an area of opportunity. So we have seen around the state and around the country, frankly, a number of those low turnout races targeted. So the main focus this year has been on those low turnout races, be it county commissions or school boards, areas of most vulnerability. Groups from the Proud Boys on over, excuse me, are running candidates to try to get them elected to local office. That does two things. One is it gives them a taste of what it's like to have a position of power like that. But two is it allows them to have some level of respectability, right? They have the imprimatur of being a local elected official, to allow them to continue to both push their far right activity as well as have that position, right? So it's harder to criticize someone if they're it's a county council person, as opposed to, that's that's a Proud Boy, right? It's more challenging to try and expose them for what they're doing. So yeah, it's a real challenge. In places like Eatonville, there you've got folks like 3%ers who have already use this technique to find their way onto the school board. And we know that there are at least a half a dozen school boards for the next election cycle who are being targeted by far rightists. And we anticipate even more as we head into 2022.
Is there any organization that's doing solid message testing around organizing against the right?
That's a good question. It's been limited, I think, and it's mostly been issue based. I know we work in coalition with some folks who have done some good message testing around kind of nativist and anti-immigrant sentiment, and some of the work that's being done in that field. There is an effort that's underway by a coalition of folks to look at some of the insurrectionist messaging, but I don't think they have released their data yet. I will look into that. I know that we've talked to some of those folks who are doing that, but I don't have a clear answer for you.
Okay. Hang on, I'm just looking through these questions. How can we increase mainstream media attention to this issue?
That's a great question. We've had some success at bringing media attention to it. We've had pieces in the New York Times, the Washington Post, NPR, and other sources. But part of what is required is a mobilization in opposition or a mobilization for something else. Part of what has happened, particularly during the pandemic, is that it's largely been organizing on one side to politicize the pandemic and turn it into a far right fantasy, while those of us on the other side have largely been trying to stop the pandemic by doing the things that we've been told to do to try to decrease the spread of the virus, and to try to help with things like drives around getting out the vaccines, or helping folks deal with the challenges that are faced in the middle of a pandemic. So what's happened is, on that terrain, there's essentially one team suiting up, and they've dominated the discussion in many parts of the country. They've taken over the rhetoric around the pandemic, and moved us from a united national effort to try to eliminate the pandemic to you're in it by yourself, and or this is all a hoax and or a Jewish conspiracy. So it's going to require us to really engage in the kind of mobilization around these issues and to really speak forward about it. I'm encouraged by some things. Like, we've made a bunch of inroads with folks like at Voices for Vaccines and other folks who are healthcare providers who are helping distribute the vaccines. We've worked with them to kind of help them understand some of the challenges that they're up against, and as well as working with some nurses unions and other healthcare providers and unions, teachers unions and others, to try to work through some of that stuff. But it requires, I think, a larger, more multifaceted effort to speak out against this stuff, because if not, it's going to continue to wreak havoc amongst us all, and we're going to be dealing with this for a lot more challenging times ahead.
So I'm going to pose one more question, then we're going to close out. How would you start a conversation with a family member that appears to be on the path toward radicalization? For example, stating that crime and identity politics pose the biggest threat to the U.S., let's see. Is there a proven path to having productive conversations and helping avoid radicalization?
That is a great question. There is. We've done a lot of research on this, and we've worked with a bunch of sociologists and others to try to unpack this very question. And because it's a family member, you have the first thing of what we call the 3 Ps of de-radicalization, which is the personal. You already have that connection, right? It's somebody you have a close personal relationship. So that's really important. The other 2 Ps are push and pull. That means you need to be able to, in your conversation, push away the bad ideas and force those into, away, saying, look, this is not stuff I believe in. I don't want to talk about it. It's toxic and it's hurting you and your family. But at the same time, you need to pull them closer. You don't need to push them away and saying, I'm never going to talk to you again because you believe these ideas. It's I love you as a person, but I can't deal with those ideas at minimum, right? That's at least a starting place, right? That push pull. When getting into those questions, then it's important to then start unpacking what they mean by those terms, right? Because so often this stuff is surface level and doesn't have a really deep understanding. So when they start talking about identity politics, what does that really mean, right? And then it allows you to peel back some of those layers and get to what they're really talking about. Are they concerned about, are they concerned about the visibility of more people of color? Are they concerned about the language that they're using? What is it, right? So, and then from there, you can then try to bring in some additional information that might help give them a different perspective on it. There's a really good piece that I'll make sure to give Katie so she can forward it to you about some of the work to do those things to try to unpack some of those conspiracies. That'll be more helpful than we could go into here, but that's a really good question. And those are the kind of things that are really important, that kind of one-on-one things are essential, as are the collective efforts that we do to really move forward as a movement to challenge racism and bigotry here in the 21st century.
Evan, thank you so much. This was really wonderful. And people are welcome to forward us any more questions, and we can pass them on to Devin, and we'll forward his replies to you. I had posted a link to the evaluation form in the chat. And also you can click on our workshops at the link in the chat to see the workshops that are remaining in this current series. So thank you so much for attending, everybody. We really appreciate your coming. And this concludes our presentation. Good night.